as imperative as leveling up and magic potions, as intriguing as wizards and sorcerers, as gods and as traps, monster hunting is one of the most exciting parts of the fantasy role-playing game genre. However, human beings in the real world have been engaging in vast and important hunts for as long as there have been people on the planet, and today we're going to talk about monster hunting in a fantasy world. But before we get into our regular topics, I do want to say this video is once again sponsored by our good pals from Tales from Elsewhere. Their Kickstarter for the Clock World is going live very soon, and if you are interested in a Wild West expansive role-playing game with intriguing monsters, an interesting wound system, and frankly speaking, some of the best art and production value that I have seen in an indie RPG in a hot minute, go to the description below, join the Kickstarter. Technically speaking, yes, this is sponsored, but let's be real, I was going to buy the game anyway. Thank you to Tales from Elsewhere for backing us up and just for making something that I feel excited to talk about. Hello everyone, my name is Kyle, I am the dork that makes you fine folks the desks, and a couple of things before we get started. If you want to support the work that we do here at Desks and Dorks, we have a Patreon, the link in the description, or this QR code will take you there, and for $10 a month, you get your own unique role-playing game that you can't get anywhere else, and that gets shuffled away basically into the vault, never to be seen again, strictly for the patrons. And for $3 a month, you also get early access to some of our awesome content. However, if you want a physical copy of some of our games, you can get them from our friends over at Tabletop Bookshelf, but you can also get them now from Indie Press Revolution, which as of right now officially has copies of A Fear Within, our newest role-playing game. Now, with that out of the way, what are we going to be discussing today? For those of you who don't know, I studied to be a medievalist. It's one of the things I love using in my role-playing games, and it's inspiration for the stuff that I play. And so today we're going to be talking about how human beings fought, hunted, and stalked their prey throughout the years. We'll be talking about exactly how to make monsters that feel real, and we're going to be using real-life historical hunting techniques and examples of real hunts to help us do that. As always, however, I'm going to urge this for two reasons. Please make sure you're using some safety and communication tools. I know a lot of players are sensitive to animal death in particular, especially because I play with a lot of friends, some of whom have actually recently lost their pets. It's kind of a touchy subject for them, so I'm just going to remind you, just make sure your players are doing okay. Check in on everybody. Try to be good people. That's all that matters. All right, with that out of the way, let's talk about hunting in general, because before I think we can move in earnest towards talking about monster hunting, we have to talk about why humans hunt in general and what it is that drives us to hunt in the first place. And the big first thing that we need to do, or the first really important thing we have to talk about, is food. Yeah, see, before the actual, formation of real agriculture, the domestication of herd and pack beasts, or the formation of even the first towns and cities, human beings have needed to go and track down their food. This means that hunting played a very vital role, not just in the development of early human civilization, but in human evolution, with traits that allowed good hunters or skilled hunters being passed on from generation to generation, thanks to selective evolution, which is kind of cool. It's part of how we evolved as a species. One of the things, however, that I don't think a lot of folks talk about is how important protein is in the development of the brain. Having access to a sufficient supply of protein is essential, not just for brain development and brain health right now, like as you and I exist, but for a anatomical sort of anthropology perspective, having access to a more protein-dense, rich diet actually leads to greater brain growth across the length of the species. And so having access to those things, hunting, essentially, the more effective that we became at getting access to protein and protein-rich resources, the more our brains developed as a species. So literally, the human race is a story not just of getting food, but of essentially getting the proteins that we need to allow our brains to develop in such a way. It's part of the reason that hunting was important, and that later, the foundation of agriculture and the domestication of herd animals mattered. But again, we have to start somewhere. we have to start with hunting, and hunting being linked to early brain development is kind of a cool angle I don't think people talk about quite enough. It's also important for us to understand that hunting is very, very important in areas where agriculture or gathering are incredibly difficult. Think of sort of, not like total and complete like snowy wastelands, like there's nobody living in Antarctica, right? But if you're living in places like the taigas of Russia or the steppe, if you're living near the Gobi Desert, for example, these are all great examples where people do live and rely on certain types of hunting and gathering to help supplement their existing diet. And that, I think, does matter a great deal and helps explain why people would hunt. In our case, it's why they would hunt a normal animal. In the case of a fantasy, civilization, a fantasy race, a fantasy city, it might explain why people are desperate enough to go out and hunt vast or powerful beasts. And lastly, I think it's really important for us to understand that despite the fact that humans are driven to survive and also thrive, we kind of also want to be a little bit bougie at times, and a person might be driven to hunt because it's a delicacy. Some of the things that people are willing to risk their lives for are things that are potentially maybe not necessarily the most delicious or most nutritious, but are important status symbols in some cases, could be sold or traded for a lot of money and or benefit, and yes, in some cases are matched by their danger in terms of their deliciousness. These are all important reasons why an individual might be willing to engage in a hunt. These are why historical people engaged in hunts, and you could use any one of those as a motivation, a sort of guiding principle, or just additional world building or storytelling texture in your role-playing games to explain why your characters, your NPCs, or anyone around you engages in the kind of monster hunting that you and I and people living in a good, safe, modern era might necessarily turn our noses up at. Now, here's the thing. Usually in these videos, I like to put how to use this in our games at the end. I thought it would be interesting, though, to play around with the idea of doing this at the end of each chapter of the video, so you get a bunch of different ways to use this in your games. And let me know in the comments below if you like this change or if you like having it all in one particular section. One of the things that I think you should do, particularly when you're encouraging your players to monster hunt, is to give them a monster that's capable of providing enough resources to make it worth it, but making those resources something beyond magic, beyond wealth, making those resources essential to survival. I call this animal the Daladerm. It's an incredibly dangerous animal. It is a large omnivore. Obviously, look at those teeth, but also look at its elephant-like body. However, the reason that somebody might hunt a Daladerm is that its food is very dense and calorie-rich, meaning players could create Daladerm jerky and essentially stretch their rations out for months upon months at end. Or if you're playing in a Neolithic style of campaign where the players are just in the burgeoning age of a new civilization or a new species, then a Daladerm could keep their entire village fed for a year or maybe even more. Now, again, its ferocity, its size, make this a difficult hunt, a dangerous hunt, but the inevitable reward of being able to provide for the entirety of the village, or to provide for the entirety of their adventuring budget going on into, the near future, means this is something that a player might be willing to risk their lives for, especially if you're playing in a game or in a game world where resources are scarce and survival is an important aspect and axis of the kind of game that you are playing. But beyond the need for food, a lot of times human beings are willing to fight and hunt if there's an important resource to be gained from it. Now, you might be thinking, well, what kind of resources can an animal give us, right? You already talked about food. That's, kind of the biggest thing, but I think we forget a lot of times that civilization began with tools fashioned from the very natural gifts of animals. Animal bone tools, knives, arrowheads, fishing hooks helped to pave the way for, early hunting and gathering cultures. And these were really important, especially at a time we hadn't exactly figured out metallurgy yet, and they were helpful to allow human beings to advance. Yeah, you don't want to fight the giant moose which as we all know is God's version of a tank, but you're certainly willing to do so if the antlers can be used and fashioned to make all kinds of incredible weapons. And beyond the use of just simple weapons and tools, let's also not forget that human beings are willing to risk things for cultural and religious reasons. There are a number of cultures across all types of continents, whether we are talking about the deserts of Africa or the Middle East, or whether we are talking about the steppes of early Mongolia or the giant vast forests of North America. There are cultures across time and history that associated hunting and animals with a kind of totemic religious significance. Fighting and hunting these animals was seen as important for a number of different societies for things like religious rituals, ornamentation, or for cultural rights to be able to advance on as a leader, a warrior, a man, a woman, or a person of importance. Sometimes was wrapped up with the idea that you had to hunt and destroy an apex predator and turn its bones into something useful and something helpful, or at least helpful in the cultural sense, right? This ornamentation is important, even though it doesn't serve an actual practical purpose to these cultures, these religions, and these particular movements. These were vital, critical, and important resources that could only be gained from certain animals. Let's also not forget that for many cultures and tribes, the skin of the animal itself was used for clothing and for shelter. This is especially true for nomadic groups of people, whereby you want the thing for food, but you also want it because a successful hunt means that you and your family have shelter for the coming winter, or things to keep you warm and dry when the rains come. Again, there's a number of reasons a human being would risk themselves, and not all of them necessarily happen to be around a good meal. Sometimes you need the religious drip, sometimes you need the weapons, but also sometimes, defeating an animal means the idea of having a house. But I also think it's important for us to consider that as humans understand what animals can do for them and the parts of animals, how they function in terms of science, they'll go after bigger and more dangerous ones. The whale trade is a great example of this, where sperm whale oil was used primarily as a method of both lighting and combustion. That's an important thing, and nobody wants to go risk their lives against a giant leviathan-sized beast using spears attached to the very thing that is keeping you afloat. Nobody wants to do that, but if it's the difference between a high quality life or the ability to make a good living and or trade, then you're going to risk that, and it's going to be important. And we do this now in the modern era. Horseshoe crab's blood, it continues to be a vital and important aspect to a number of different pharmaceutical processes, life-saving vaccines, and important cutting-edge research. So even now, we're still using animals for a lot of important stuff that is more than just treating them kind of like, a mobile McDonald's with fur. Now, you could use this in your games a number of different ways, but me personally, I really love the angle of talking about the whale. There's something perhaps, really attention grabbing about whales as monsters or as NPCs. Maybe it's just because I loved Moby Dick when I was younger, or maybe it's because one of my favorite games is Hell Whalers, which is a fantastic role-playing game, but I love the idea of using what I call Leviathans. That's a reference to Leviticus, which is where the biblical Leviathan appears. These whales have a kind of dark, rose-colored blood. Now, here's the thing. The blood acts as a number of different things. It's anti-inflammatory, yes, which means that the blood is highly sought after as a type of medicinal remedy to help keep people alive during bouts of potential sickness. However, it's also an incredibly powerful hallucinogen. This means that really savvy players can use this as a way to harness minor future sight abilities, or they can sell it to a priesthood that has formed on the coasts that uses that blood in order to actually summon upon great rituals in people who already have clairvoyant abilities. Something like the Leviathan allows the players to consider a hunt that is spectacularly dangerous, that puts them into incredibly hostile waters, pun fully intended, but in doing so could mean a massive fortune and a huge reversal of change for the players themselves. These are the kind of things I would like you to consider when you're throwing monster hunting into your games. You're going to need to give people a good reason to go out, risk life and limb, and battle against a creature that is alien, large, powerful, or at the very least vicious and potentially deadly. But the most talked about reason, or at least the one that pops up the most in popular imagination, is survival. The stories of a vicious, man-eating predator prowling around in the jungle or the desert or along the Arctic plain is a story and tale that is as old as time and perhaps as intrinsic to the human experience as any other myth and legend. And this is especially true when we get into the incredible powers of the dark forces, the monsters that prowl about in myth and legend, right? These are the stories of the man-eating beast personified. These are the stories of the animal gone rogue, cranked up to 11 and turned loose on our active imagination. So there's a reason that the idea of surviving in a harsh world against beasts is a big deal and is a huge inspiration point for fantasy monster hunting. However, as intriguing as it is, or as just, unbelievably insane, like this art piece, by the way, by Sandra Zuloff, which is unbelievably nightmare-inducing, it actually leads us to a misconception. The majority of animals, at least historic ones, don't go out of their way to hurt or attack or hunt us unless something is horribly, horribly, horribly wrong. One of the things that pops up and can turn an animal from a reasonable creature who's protecting their territory, or at least just trying to provide for themselves, into an actual man-eater is injury or sickness. A lot of times this happens, though, as a result of being exposed to or encountering humans that are a little bit overzealous. For example, some animals have been wounded by, errant hunters, and as a result, those wounds either heal back poorly or don't heal back properly at all, and as a result, the hunter, now forced to actually deal with the fact that they can't go after higher levels of prey, start preying on unsuspecting people, which are a lot of times a much easier target than, say, a faster moving or more muscular animal. Another thing that can potentially cause monsters, or in our case animals, to become particularly hostile and aggressive is the loss of habitat. As human beings have continued to expand, one of the things that is unfortunate is that we have continued to either destroy or at the very least certainly disintegrate elements of animal habitats, and as a result, the natural order can get upset. Those animals can lose either their place in the food chain in general, or lose the things that once helped provide a life for them and are forced to turn to desperate measures. Kind of like how humans do when we are exposed to similar situations. And lastly, sometimes this can happen when you are going up to an animal at a very wrong time, particularly during mating season or birthing season, is when some animals will turn from a, again, mostly reasonable creature who just sort of has their own routine and terrain, and turn them into something that is akin to the monsters of myth, legend, and nightmare. Unless we're talking about polar bears. Those are nature's cruise missiles. Now, one of the best sources on this, if you're interested in the example of a man-eating beast, is actually called Man-Eaters of Cumaean. This is a fantastic text written by Jim Corbett. Those of you who might not be familiar with Mr. Corbett are missing out on one of history's greatest adventurers, I truly believe. Jim was born to British governors in India, so again, this technically makes him Indian, and as a result, Corbett is sort of caught between two worlds. According to culture at the time, because he was born in India, most of his British contemporaries didn't really regard him as British, or kind of kept him at arm's length. And obviously, although he is born in India, he clearly doesn't look like an Indian. And of course, there's a lot of resentment built up in the colonialism and imperialism of Britain's governance of India. So he wasn't really accepted by people in India either, at least not at first. And so, as a result of this, Jim spends a lot of time in one of the few places that allows him a degree of freedom and acceptance, the wilderness, and he becomes an exceptional and incredible big game hunter. Man-Eaters of Cumaean is about his stories, essentially finding, tracking, and destroying man-eating animals, including his greatest story, the Champawat man-eater, about a tiger that ate somewhere close to like the 500 mark of people, and at one point stopped an entire logging operation from being able to run. What makes Corbett particularly interesting, though, especially as a big game hunter, is that as his life continued on, he continued to feel more kinship with the animals that he was actually dealing with than the people around him. And you can actually visit Corbett National Park right now, which is really cool. Also has one of my absolute favorite quotes in the entire world: better to see a tiger through the lens of a camera than through the scope of a rifle. Jim Corbett is one of those people that kind of exemplifies the point, and the Champawat Maneater, who I just mentioned, his greatest crowning achievement as a big game hunter and slayer of man-eaters, the Champawat Maneater was discovered to have a deeply infected and impacted tooth as a result of a hunting accident that made her unable to go after her normal prey, and as a result, she went after women, children, and the elderly, those too slow or not strong enough to fend her off. Again, this is a great example of the kind of hunting traits that I'm talking about in these regions. Now, you might be wondering how we're going to use that in our games, and for this one, I wanted to include a monster of a more mythical bent. These are the Glade Ghosts. Essentially, they're not really harmful. They're sort of peaceful beings. For the most part, they actually just want to propagate their glade and repopulate it over the years. They live the lives of essentially normal trees, albeit a little more sentient and a little more savage when pushed. They plant their new saplings into the corpses of dead animals. However, as humans have begun to expand into the wilderness, there are far less animals for them to implant with the seed. As a result of that, the Glade Ghosts have begun to sort of implant themselves in individuals in small villages, forcing trees and vines to burst violently out forth from those individuals, and causing the king and the local governments to scramble to find an answer for the Glade Ghosts. But the reason I love these monsters is there's just so many different ways the players could approach a problem like the Glade guys. One of the potential solutions they could have doesn't even involve fighting those creatures. Maybe after a few hunts that are successful, unsuccessful, or are varying degrees of horrifically scuffed, the players decide to reforest a large section of the area and petition the king and the guilds to change the logging patterns, thus the humans don't run into, I don't know, people that turn you into a reverse tree pinata. That's probably a pretty good idea. Or they could just try to migrate those frontier villages away from the logging areas and move that entire section of logging somewhere else without bothering to reforest and create a new habitat. This might be the easier solution in the short term, but it might be a lot more of a difficult solution in the long term, and who knows, maybe our good old pals the Glade guys will be back at a later date, maybe stronger and maybe a little bit more ticked off if the players decide to go this route. Another interesting thing though is they could just set fire to the woods, and that brings me to the idea that when it comes to hunting monsters or hunting large animals in general, you as a game master should both encourage and understand that your party isn't going to fight fair. This is one of the two great secrets when it comes to monster hunting and the hunting of dangerous beasts in general. Humanity is not good at taking a fight without actually taking every single dirty advantage, cheap trick, and underhanded tactic in the book. Or, to quote a good friend of mine from the Marine Corps, if you ever find yourself in a fair fight, shoot your tactician. Human beings love playing dirty, and we especially love doing it when there is something on the line and we are up against a far more powerful foe. And this is especially true with animals and things that have a larger, greater frame and physical ability than us. It goes beyond tools, right? Humans, for example, like to use pheromones or things approximating pheromones, playing with the senses of animals and large, hunting beasts, or in this case, our large prey, as a way of getting an advantage from them, right? Whether it's coating a place with the blood of a predator's specific prey animal, or spraying the area with pheromones like a female version of that species in heat, humans are really, really, really good at trying to take you out when you're doing the things that are going to leave you completely vulnerable. The idea, by the way, one of the earliest ideas that I have heard of this, comes from the woolly mammoth, or how cavemen apparently used to try to drive this thing off of cliffs as a way of taking advantage of God's two great equalizing weapons: gravity and the willingness to be a rat bastard about it. Now, here's the other thing that I think is really interesting. Humans love traps, and if you're going to employ monster hunting in any way, shape, or form, you should use traps. They should be things that the players are able to assemble, like giant, demented fantasy versions of a Rube Goldberg machine. Monsters who are sentient and against the party should also set up traps. There should be traps set up by the NPCs. Everybody should have traps, even if it's just a simple stake pit like this, or using things like bait, meat, and fresh prey on a hook. You should have some traps. But our greatest strength isn't cheating. No. Our greatest strength is in good old-fashioned prep time and jolly cooperation. Humanity's greatest ability when battling against a far more superior, in air quotes, force when it comes to size, strength, and sheer terror is that most species are unable to or unwilling to work together in quite the same way or prepare together in quite the same way that your average mortal. I brought up the example of mammoths being hunted and pushed off cliffs earlier, but that was actually a lie, a red herring. Research now tells us that this was most likely something that wasn't widespread as a practice, and the majority of the research now supports something far more interesting, at least in my mind as a historiographer and somebody who wants to include historical details in my games. It's not just that humans scared the mammoths off cliffs, it was that human beings coordinated the mammoth to exhaust them into positions where the mammoth was more vulnerable, where they would be surrounded on all sides by allies of the hunting party, and then brought down not through the sheer force of gravity, but by the sheer force of humanity's ability to cooperate and coordinate. Hunting in large parties like this is a perfect example of what makes human beings special, or mortal beings in general, if you're playing any other fantasy setting, special as characters, as players, as a threat to larger, more monstrous foes. It is not just that we are cunning, it is that we are cunning in groups, and we are willing to work together to risk harm or injury to ourselves so that a greater whole can survive and they can win. So now we're going to move on, though, to talking about something I think is going to be particularly important for you as game masters, which is what can you do to make your hunts in your game feel incredible, give them that life and that breath, that verisimilitude that makes them compelling and interesting for your players, and hopefully fun for you to use as a GM. Well, the first thing I'm going to encourage you to do is to track your monsters. This is critical in helping your players feel like they have earned this. Give your players time to chart a path, to assemble clues, to figure out where the monster likes to roost, and figure out how the monster goes about its business, rotating from place to place. It's going to be so much more satisfying when your players have had multiple sessions to play detective in the wilderness, and through that detective work, find, discover, and finally take down their quarry. Also, we talked about traps, but there's a lot of really interesting ones that historians have documented, or that were just documented for us from the Middle Ages by the people that lived there. I particularly am partial to the net wall, which was used to bring down large predatory animals. Essentially, what you would use is dogs or a hunting party to flush where you thought the predators were going into the net wall. It would, capture and ensnare them, and then you would use spears or arrows to take them out. Now, here's the thing. There are so many other traps that we can talk about, and if you're going to make the world feel a little bit more lived in terms of hunting, then just like good old Fred Jones, we gotta go for some traps, baby. Snares, or things essentially like bear traps, were commonly used against very large predators. This was useful if you wanted to sort of cordon off an entire area, but were far less effective because they could essentially hit anything that moved through it. So again, your mileage may vary. You could also use a combination of hunting dogs and mounted hunters to help drive or flush out prey from dense areas. Things like horses, the hoofbeats of the horses, the noise, and even the smell of horses in some cases can spook large, or in many cases elusive, prey animals into moving, or in our case, perhaps large prey monsters into moving. It's weird, by the way, to consider monsters as our prey, but you know what? I'm into it. So another thing you could do is you could use the dogs to flush them out, or as this illustration shows, you could flush the monster out into a pack of well-trained hunting animals. This is a really cool technique, and it is one that is used, and at least I find it very interesting and compelling. Another amazing trap for catching larger, or smaller, I should say, fowl, is to set essentially what is a net sandwich. What you do is you have the two nets attached there, you have some sort of feed established, you are in the underbrush, and then when you pull the peg, the nets literally collapse around them like a sandwich, allowing you to take out the fowl at your leisure. Here's the thing. Even in a place of fantastic myth, magic, and legend, your characters, your people, are going to be far, far, far more dangerous than you think. And I think that's a really important thing for us to remember, particularly because in a world with monsters in it, it can seem like these creatures are far more daunting and far more terrifying than possible. And that's just not necessarily always the case. Creatures are only as powerful as their ability to make those powers come to bear. So if they are stopped, ensnared, trapped, or destroyed before they can use any of that fancy pants magic or power, then guess what? They're just a bunch of meat. And I think that's kind of awesome. Now, we have talked at length about the Witchers. I have brought up the Witcher several times in this video already, and I think it's important for us to do it, not just because I love this art from the Season of the Witcher expansion, but because it begs the question, what kind of people would hunt monsters? I have said this before in many videos, but your average person is not going to want to go out and hunt dragons, battle ogres, or duke it out with orcs. I am not going to leave my healthy marriage, profitable winery, and 6 children, and my villa in the countryside to go with you and battle vampires in a catacomb 200 meters below the ground. Tim, it's not happening. Tim, no sane person wants to do that. So what kind of people would be the ones that we think would be called into service to battle against monsters? And really it falls into 2 camps. The first is the desperate, the destitute, those with no other options. And when I thought about people who lacked options on a large systemic way, I thought about the convicts that were sent from England over to Australia, back when Australia was still a penal colony. Here's the thing, these people had no other options but to go to the closest thing that Earth has to a country full of actual monsters, right? Like something like 50 of the 55 most poisonous snakes live in Australia. Like you can just get stung by one errant jellyfish and your entire bloodline is snuffed out. You can step on a rockfish and then just instantly be disintegrated. Like it's insane. There are spiders the size of dinner plates. If you don't know what swooping season is, it's a literal time where birds swoop down on the heads of small children while they're leaving school. Australia is a bizarre world. Also, sidebar, and I know this is a total caveat that maybe I shouldn't put in this video, but if I had a time machine, I would love to see the horror and reaction on people's faces, like the range of emotion, I think is probably a better way of putting that. Like, imagine you are a cut purse sent from England all the way to Australia, and you're like, I can't believe I'm here. I thought I was gonna get hung, and now look at it. There's blue sky, and blue water, and blue everything. Isn't that right, Loomis? Yeah, that's right there, Chuck. And then Loomis steps on a rockfish and immediately dies. No, Loomis, what's happening? Like, I like the range of emotions. Anyway, moving on. The desperate would be individuals who either have no other options, think like criminals forced to battle monsters, highwaymen forced to contend with beasts because they are forced to live out in the wilderness, or villagers forced to defend their homes when they have no other options and when their backs are up against the wall against horrific and terrifying monsters. The desperate have to fight a monster, have to hunt a monster, either because of total need, a lack of options, or because their very existence simply depends on it. These are monster hunters not by choice, but by necessity. And I really think they make for interesting and compelling storytelling narratives, because imagine the lengths that somebody will go to when it's not that they want to destroy the monster, it's that they must. destroy the monster. And on that note, however, I do think the specialized fit into their own camp as well. I will continue to talk about the Witchers, but one of the things that I find so compelling about this fantasy world is it treats monster hunting the way that most of medieval Europe treated problems of economics and social strata. The Witchers are, for all intents and purposes, a guild, the same way that there is a blacksmith's guild, or a merchant's guild, or a leatherworker's guild, or a cobbler's guild, right? They have their own set of ethics. They have a code of conduct by which they measure additional members. They have parameters which they use to interact with the public. And if you watch the TV shows, read the books, or played the video games, you'll know that sometimes Geralt does work not for free, but sometimes for free or at a greatly reduced rate to help improve the understanding of and appreciation of his guild in the eyes of the common folk, which is something that happened in real guilds. This means that these individuals, the specialized, are folks willing to do this, not because it is easy, but because it is an expensive thing for other people. Again, we talked about desperation, but imagine if you are willing to risk life and limb and what you can get because of that. If there's a small fortune to be made, I got news for you. I think there are plenty of medieval people who would legitimately choose to fight monsters over one another. Would you like to battle against the ogre, or do you want to go into the front line against the Spanish? Again, your options might be limited, and it might be a great way to make some cash. Not just The Witcher though, but imagine a world where mercenaries decide that they're not going to take the fight against one another, but against the very monsters of the world. How would it look like in your game world if individuals developed techniques, weapons, armor, and specialized equipment not for the destruction of people, like things like the billhook, which we talked about in our previous video on weird weapons? Like, that's a farming implement developed to take down cavalry, but imagine what kind of weapons humanity would have cooked up if they had to battle creatures for profit. It's stuff like this that I think, if you take a second to consider, will allow you to make some exceptional and some incredible game worlds. And with that, my friends, that is the end of the video. If you like what we do here, please do me a huge solid. Why not back us on Patreon? $10 a month gets you your own unique role-playing game, something you can't get anywhere else. And if you want physical copies, Indie Press Revolution, one of our longest and most trusted distributors, now has copies of A Fear Within, our brand new horror role-playing game with a focus on storytelling. If you like Goosebumps, Are You Afraid of the Dark, or Pokemon, or actually Digimon is probably a closer approximation, you will absolutely love the game. And finally, if you want digital copies of any of our stuff, you can get it over on itch.io. We have a sale going on right now that ends next week, but you can get After the Rain or You Have Always Lived in the Lighthouse for just $5, a pretty steep discount from where they usually are. But before I do anything else, I have to thank my amazing patrons and my YouTube members. Dionysus, Chris Bates, Agile Monk, Aiden Delaney, Brian, Corbino the Great, Solution, Alex.vksh, Papa Dinosaur, Chromatic Orbital Strike, Chris Mayer, Darth, Gaming Gamison, Ro.kn, Commander Unidentified, Arcane Bard, Stefan Brissot, and Darjeeling Trailblazer. Thank you all so much for your support, folks. It means the absolute world to me, and the support that you give me allows me to continue to make the games and the videos like these. But until next time, folks, I'm Kyle out for Desks and Dorks. You have all been absolutely amazing. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.